Take your Bible this morning, if you would, and turn to Matthew chapter 2 this morning. Matthew chapter 2. As we have the privilege of even singing and worshiping this morning, it is to our attention that we're going to give ourselves to the part of the narrative of the birth story that includes the Wisemen. Certainly this morning, as we've sang together, and it certainly doesn't escape our minds that our goal and our orientation in our hearts must be one of worship. We didn't come here simply just to see familiar faces, more than we have come and tried to reflect during this season about the worship of our great God and King Jesus Christ. I hope you find this in your own life, that worship is not just simply something that is drudgery to your life, that you find that it's a joy, that it's a privilege, all at the same while it is a duty, it is a responsibility that as Christians you and I have. He deserves our worship. He desires for us to bring it to him freely, not something that is coerced or mechanical. He wants sincerity. He wants a sacrifice and a selfless nature to our worship. Even as we come in to this particular text this morning, we're going to focus our attention on the main idea that you see before you in the bulletin this morning, that the purpose of the Christian journey is to worship Christ the King. So our job together this morning as we study the scripture is to see how worthy and remarkable this king is, and why these wise men would come from afar just to worship this child who is now going to be king of Israel. Let's turn our attention to Matthew chapter 2 and follow with me as I read the first 12 verses as we acclimate our minds to this story. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Israel with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Well, then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared to them. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I too may come and worship him.' After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before him until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way." There's a lot of tradition and perspective on these wise men. I remember in one of the first churches that I was pastoring in, every particular Christmas season, we would gather all of the bins that had the Christmas items in it. Of course, the nativity scene was always one of those things that would get set up in the foyer so that it would bring a level of ambiance and a reflection of the Christmas narrative to the moment you walked in. And in most Christmas scenes, even if you Googled it and looked at a picture, you find that most people look and have the wise men at the manger scene. And if you were here for our Christmas program, you noticed that the wise men came and that the baby child, ironically, which was Judah, was older. And they weren't in a manger, and they weren't in the cave. They were now in a house. And so oftentimes I would come in, and I was there earlier before everybody else. And sure enough, every year that those three wise men would be sitting by the manger. And I'd kind of sneak over there, grab those three little figures, and put them over by the drinking fountain so it looked like they're traveling. They're still going. Somebody said, where's those wise men? I said, they're not here yet. Look it, they're over there. They saw the star, but they're heading out. There is a lot of perspective on when and who and even how many of these wise men came to worship. But I want to give us a key text or a key phrase that Matthew gives us an indicator of his theological emphasis to why he includes this in the story of the birth narrative. It's Matthew chapter 2, verse 2. Where the wise men say, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. See, Matthew gives us an indicator of the reason why they came, and we're going to unpack that together. But I also want us to recognize about who they're coming to. And remember that this story, by the way, as you see it in its fuller context in Matthew, is also a good reminder for us that this birth narrative is set within a setting where we can see the prince and power of this world, the devil, does not want this child to come and rule and reign. He will orchestrate events and push various things and persuade different things, demonically and otherwise, to get this individual off the scene. It is his one main goal of his entire existence now as the prince and power of the world, is to detract you from the worship of the king. That's what this story is partly about. The devil is doing his best in the story of the wise men to extinguish the coming king so that no one would see to it that they worship him, not even these wise men. It is Herod, the king with a small k, against the coming king, who is truly, by birth and by God's design, the rightful heir of the throne and the line of David and of Judah. He alone. That's why Matthew, I think, gives us these indicators of Herod the king. He wants us in our minds to say, wait a minute, you're not the king. We've got somebody coming who is actually the king. That is our main focus in our own lives, is it not? Do you not find that pull in your life to worship something, someone other than God? Finding your joy, your aspirations, your purpose, your satisfaction in this life? Every single time that Satan can draw your attention away from the worship of this king, he succeeds. He succeeds in not allowing you either to see Christ and blinding the eyes of people who need Christ and distracting us who have Christ to things that appear to be of greater value. And I would beg you, as I have continued to search my own heart, to ask myself, what are those things in my life that are distracting me from the worship of the King? What things does my heart begin to long for and believe that I must have? We live in a world that is most often, as Paul Tripp describes, a kingdom of self. We're most often concerned about our own perspective, our own comfort and peace. And yet he has come to elevate our perspective so that we can see this King of kings and Lords of lords. Herod took the region as king of Judea by force, but Jesus, as it was his by birth and by right and according to prophecy. He alone, according to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, would be shown as the one come from the line of and lineage of David. He alone would be the worthy king. Now let's take a look at the situation that we find this story bringing us to. It gives us, by the way, a couple indicators. And anytime you study the Bible, I think it's really important for all of us to kind of get the picture of who, what, when, where, why, and what's going on. So we're going to do a little bit of that, I think, this morning. So when we think about the when in the text, it's really important to recognize these two time indicators, and you see them behind me on the screens. One, now after the birth of Jesus. Now remember, these accounts were theologically orientated to express something that had already occurred historically and to affirm it by eyewitness accounts. The gospel accounts were not written in correspondence immediately when the birth narrative was going on, but was referenced to them by firsthand witnesses. And now this was after, and it was feeding the church to understand who this Jesus was, why he came, and why he was their king, and that he would come back one day. So these time indicators are critical. And the second one is in the days of Herod the king. I'm going to leave that for a moment. We're going to come back and talk about Herod for a moment here in just a little bit. But these time indicators are critical. Now, after the birth of Jesus, well, what has already transpired at this point, since we know that the wise men didn't come to the manger scene? So what has already transpired? Well, one, we know from Luke chapter 2, verse 7, they were no longer in the manger, but they were in a house. The wise men came to the house. We know that preceding this, at the time of the birth of Christ, the angels would appear in a plethora in the sky to exhort and to tell the shepherds, there has been one born who is going to be king. Go and see him. The shepherds had already come to the manger scene, and what does it tell you in Luke chapter 20? Luke chapter 2, verse 20, and they went away glorifying God and praising God. And then this, you think they did all that and then told no one? No, they told everybody they could find. So you can imagine now, all of a sudden, in between this, the shepherds saw the glory of the angelic chorus to be able to say to them, there is this birth child. You already have in Luke chapter 2, the offering or coming of the circumcision. You already have the presentation of Simeon at the temple. This would have been when the days of purification were over, which is roughly around 40 or so days, so just over a month. That's already occurred. Simeon gave this prophetic proclamation saying, wow, now I can die. I have seen your salvation. Just about when he's done, Anna comes up and she realizes what's going on. And can you imagine amongst the people of Jerusalem, and the scribes and the Pharisees, they were starting to get this perspective that something is happening. Something is going on. All of these things happened after Jesus was born. We recognize the predicament of Mary and Joseph, even prior to that, coming to the scene of Simeon and Anna after the days of purification when they offered the sacrifice that was required according to the Levitical standards. What did they come and bring? They came and brought 2 small turtle doves. Well, that gives us an indicator of the poor nature of Mary and Joseph. I don't think that would have been the case if the wise men had already given them their gifts and then said, well, we got these gifts, but we're going to offer the 2 turtle doves anyway. They didn't have it yet. So we realize so much has transpired, so much information by proclamation of angelic Simeon, Anna, and others, and Mary and Joseph is all, in a sense, a little bit of the buzz of the people waiting for the consummation of Israel. And then it says in the days of Herod. Herod came into power to some level at around 37 BC. He reigned in this area of Judea for roughly about 37 years. Now, what we want to know about Herod, at least for this brief moment, is to realize that when Herod comes on the scene, this is the end or closer to the end of Herod's life, at the fullness of when he was an older man reigning. At this particular point, history records a very paranoid Herod. And so when we see this idea of where, well, one, it's in the area of Bethlehem of Judea. Why is that significant? Because Matthew is trying to draw our minds to a prophetic understanding that would match what was prophesied by the prophet Micah. So these geographical indicators are there for us to connect our Old Testament and New Testament birth narrative. Now, one question that comes, I hope it will come to your mind, and we'll answer it here in a little bit, is the wise men didn't go to Bethlehem of Judah. They went to Jerusalem. Why is that? And then we have the why. Okay, we have the why, which is this idea of when we think about this story in the time of the king. We have the why. They came to worship a king. They believed this king was the rightful king. They had come to worship, and that is their expression and our focus this morning, that our worship must be pure and holy in the eyes of God. Now let's talk a little bit about the who on this next slide. Herod the Great was, in the eyes of men, a very remarkable individual. If you look back, for example, and read history books or read or watch a YouTube documentary on Herod, all of them will describe to them as he is often understood in history as Herod the Great. But it does beg the question for people what is it that made men great during that time? Well, here's what made men during the time of Herod, or people like Herod, great in the eyes of men. There were two really ways that you could really accentuate your ability to stand out, to be a man among the men. Here's one. You could go off to war and you could be a military leader and come back and say, look at all the accomplishments that I brought as a military general, and other men would look and they would say, wow, now that is a man among men. Herod, unfortunately, had no Roman jurisdiction in the sense that it was delegated to him, and his major role was not so much of a military leader, more than it was his aspirations for the second form of greatness. And you know what it was? It was to build. If you could be known in history as either a warrior, king, or a king that would be a builder. Some of the most remarkable sites, for example, that Herod is known for are, I've given you a few pictures. The aqueduct that would come all the way from the Carmel mountain range all the way down to Caesarea by the sea, so that Herod in his palace by the sea could have fresh water. A remarkable form of ingenuity, even during Herod's day. He all of a sudden decided that at this port city of Caesarea, where Paul was in the New Testament and was imprisoned there, he would make a man-made harbor so that people didn't have to brave the winter storms and could port their boat in this man-made harbor. And what would he bring in? He would bring in all kinds of money and people. And Caesarea became a dominantly Gentile city. He was known for that, a remarkable feat. To be able to say, I'm just going to make my own harbor since I don't have one. And all of a sudden, he decides to exalt himself by building things like the Herodium, which was a Judean desert in the palace, just a short ways to the east from Bethlehem. There he made his own mountain, and on the top of the mountain, he put a palace on top of the mountain where he had pools and synagogues and all of these things, just to accentuate for people to say, wow, this guy is incredible. He built in one of the most remarkable ways the fortress palace in the desert, what we understand as Masada. The more difficult the ability to build, the more remarkable the outcome would be, and the more elevated the person became. And of all of his feats, of all the things that he would build, this next slide becomes his most remarkable one of all, the temple. The temple where he would extend the Temple Mount in a way that thousands and thousands of Jews would come. Now, you might think, wow, that was really nice of Herod. Man, the Jews sure must have been happy about that. Herod was going to make sure that he brought in all kinds of people for a particular purpose, which was to tax the people so he could send the money back to Rome. all of these remarkable feats. Herod, in some degree, we would describe as a megalomaniac. His sense of self-aggrandizement and self-exaltation, obsession with power. Why would he even build the temple, by the way, historically, as we understand? It was to ingratiate himself with the Jews. Herod himself and his father, if you trace it back, and I would encourage you to do this, you could read a little bit of the intertestamental history, but understand that his heritage of his father, Antipas was an Edomian. He was an Edomite. He was outside the people of Israel. So when Herod was given by Julius Caesar the responsibility to rule the Judean area, it was with one thing in mind, as often Roman Caesars would understand. It was all about the Pax Romana. Can this Herod, keep the peace in a very volatile region? It's not as if the Jews, by the way, were real excited about the Roman influence in Jerusalem. But during this intertestamental time period where through the course of this, you have a group of people that we understand as the Maccabeans, which became a dynasty and changed the name. We understand them as the Hasmonean dynasty from Judas Maccabeus and his sons. They had ruled Jerusalem and the Judean area for over 100 years. Seeing that Rome was coming into power, that Julius Caesar was coming, and he was going to take over the region, they made a deal to be able to retain their ability to worship at the Temple Mount, as long as there was peace. But if you know anything about the Jewish people, they had this component about them where they would resist and they would never desire to view the Roman Caesar as king. Their worship would be solely directed to only one, and only one king. Herod came from this. In order to ingratiate himself, he divorced his wife Doris, and he decided to marry into the Hasmonean dynasty by marrying a woman by the name of Mariamne, so that she, of the nobility of the Hasmonean dynasty, he could then say, look, I've married in to this family, and ingratiate himself to the chief priests and to the scribes and the people. However, he never enjoyed it because the Jews always looked at him like a king usurper. It always drove, in a sense, at this moment of his life in his older ages, a paranoia of who would take his kingdom. He was infatuated with this. We know his paranoia historically because he killed Mariamne. He killed his 2 sons. He changed his will scores of times just to make sure that his kingdom would be secure. And up until 5 days before his death, he changed his will one more time. And then he arrested a whole bunch of Jews, knowing that they hated him to such a degree, he imprisoned them so that at the moment of his death, he said, at the moment I die, I want all of these Jews executed so that there will be mourning that occurs during the time of my funeral, even though he knew it wouldn't be for him. Here was a man who was crazed for power, for ambition, for people to see him as the king. See, the birth narrative comes into this story. These wise men come to Jerusalem, to Herod, at this moment of his life, under this sense of paranoia, under this ideology, keep the peace and don't take away my kingdom, is what Herod's focus was. Let's talk a little bit about the wise men. It says in verse number 2, the wise men come, and it says, we have seen his star in the east. Now, as we think about the wise men, one of the things that these textual indicators give to us is, where did these men come from? There's a lot of story behind, or tradition behind it, all the way back to Origen and Tertullian and all of these different historians through the years. In fact, we have songs that are made up about them, don't we? We 3 kings of Orient are. But do you know this? No one really knows. Most people realize they weren't kings. And yet, like their kingly status, when they came to Jerusalem, we always get pictures. You don't get this kind of picture, by the way, many times when you see the wise men coming and following the star. You just see 3 camels and 3 wise men. You don't travel like that in the ancient Near East. In fact, the Magi themselves, people often ask, well, from the east, well, where is that? Most historians understand that in one of 2 places, they either came from Babylon or they came from Persia. Or somehow, I think what we understand in the story is that they came and were influenced because of what God had already sovereignly ordained in history, all the way back to the time of Daniel. You have a faithful, prophetic ministry of a youth who had been brought under the Babylonian exile, who was elevated amongst these individuals of the Magi. Magi in this context, especially in Babylon, in the ancient Near Eastern Persia, were understood and always connected with where we get our English word magician. But they were far more than someone conjuring magical things, although often they functioned in that role to the king. But most often, Magi were also scholars, astronomers and astrologers who paid attention to various signs and understandings. Let me remind you, and maybe you could just listen to this and write it in your margin. Daniel chapter 1, verses 5 to 7. It says, the king assigned them, this is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, them a daily portion of food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, that they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah. You think these guys had a specific interest in the area of Bethlehem, Judah? I think so. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. And we could follow in Daniel chapter 2, verse 48, after this situation where Daniel interprets the dream by the work and sovereignty of God. Notice this statement in Daniel 2, verse 48. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel had and served by God's design a unique role hundreds of years prior to the Matthew story in the gospel, so that he would have already pushed, even in the Babylonian and Persian cultures, certain magi to say, what is with this king that is prophesied to come, who is the king of the Jews? See, these magi, I think, even in Daniel chapter 5, notice this verse. It says, and this is again a testimony to Daniel's prominence in the kingdom. Daniel 5 says, there's a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers. Wow. God had a plan for Daniel's exile. That Daniel's faithfulness would bear fruit hundreds and hundreds of years later to fulfill a prophecy and point these wise men to come and worship the living God. In fact, so much tradition surrounds these wise men that various individuals have often recognized their kingly status and developed the idea that there must have been perhaps 3 of them. And why would you think there would be 3? Because there were 3 gifts. Except the text itself never really indicates a number. There could have been 3, there could have been more. There was a whole entourage that came with these magi when they came to Jerusalem. So fix your mind on this idea. Here they come, and this entourage of magi come across with all the security. These were very important men in the ancient Near Eastern culture. They didn't just come alone. They would have come with this entourage, which is why, by the way, they went around the city, and the text even gives an indication that it wasn't like they just went straight to Herod. Matthew gives us a participle that gives us this idea of what they were doing. They were going all over Jerusalem going, hey, do you know where the king is that we're supposed to worship? Okay, you don't. Do you know where the king is? They were going around persistently trying to figure out where he was. Now, why Jerusalem? Well, Jerusalem's the capital city. They had some understanding of some of the prophetic understanding, but it's likely, as many assume, if you're going to have a king, where's he going to be? He's going to be in the capital city, and people will be excited about this. And yet no one was really all that excited as they were. But you could see now why the fear began to mount for even someone like Herod. Notice this in the text when he talks to them about the worship of the star. When Herod the king, in verse 3, heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, Herod was already troubled in paranoia of his own accord. He didn't want anybody taking his kingdom. There had been much going on in that particular region, and Herod did not want somebody taking his throne. And if this was an indicator that somehow some spies from the east were going to come in and usurp his reign over this area, his antennas immediately would have went up. And all people of Israel, which would have also been troubled in Jerusalem, would have been there, because if Herod was crazy enough to kill his wife, kill his sons, and do some incredible things to retain his power, then the people around him became very nervous, and the people of Israel knew the extent, to the craziness and extent that this individual would go to eliminate any other king but himself. Even various traditions even give names to these wise men, by the way. Often even that people describe them as Melchior and Balthasar and Casper, and one from an Ethiopian descent, which is often, when you see them, there's a very international flavor to the picture of where they came from, one coming from Ethiopia and others from different regions in the east. Can I just remind you, the text doesn't give us a lot about them. They come from the east. They saw the star. Now, why doesn't it give us a whole lot? I think here's why. Matthew wanted us to focus on their worship. Matthew knew we could get caught up in a lot of things, but he wanted us to get caught up in where they were going and why they were going there and what they were about to do. It was the worship of the king. The reality is, for us, as we come to this, and now he gathers all the chief priests and scribes. Now, how could Herod go and he has such good resources? He gets the chief priests and scribes and he gets them all together. Because, as I said before, he ingratiated himself with the building of the temple and all of these other things. He married into the Hasmonean dynasty. He wanted to keep the peace, and he grabs these chief priests and scribes and he says, where does this happen? And then they report to him, it is in Bethlehem of Judea. This is verse 5 in Matthew 2. He said, for so it is written by the prophet. Okay? That is so important for us as Bible students. It is written hundreds of years earlier so that we would know only God could fulfill this kind of prophecy. Yes, it's Bethlehem in the land of Judah, and by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. I mean, I'm a little bit suspicious of Herod's desire for worship, aren't you? He gathers the wise men secretively. Okay, guys, good to have you here. So you're here to worship a king. Oh, well, lo and behold, I too would love to worship this king. How about you go and find where he's at and then send word back to me? Then I too will come and bow down and prostrate myself before him. Don't you read that in the story and go, I don't know. There's something sneaky about this guy. Let me even go a step further. There is something that is happening by the work of Satan in the story of the birth narrative, as Satan has always desired to do, to use people to destroy God's plan. Oh, let me come and worship. No, I want to kill him. I want no one to usurp my role as king. The more important questions concerning the wise men are not necessarily when we think about where they came from, but how they would have heard it. And they would have heard it from Daniel. And these were individuals who would have followed the star. It's quite interesting when you recognize this understanding of the star. A lot of speculation could be had when you think, like, what is going on with this star? Postulations such as, at that particular moment for these wise men, there was some level of a supernova that happened and a star exploded. And of course, if you understand that, the light from that explosion could have remained for some months. And that's the star they followed. It's really hard to determine that. We don't have any textual markers. Others will say, in some sense, because they were astronomers and they looked at the aligning of the planets, that at that particular moment, somehow Jupiter and Saturn came into alignment according to the constellation Pisces, which eventually, of course, was the fish constellation, which became the future perspective of the Christian fish. Well, I don't know about that. The text just doesn't tell us. Here's what I do think that we have to look at the star as. This is a supernatural, miraculous occasion that God knew would garner the attention of these wise men from the east and direct them and their mind to the prophecies that perhaps they had read from the prophet Daniel and influence, and they connected the star that would come from Judah, and they followed that star, recognizing a king was to be born. I prefer to view it not as the alignment of planets or a supernova, but of the strictly supernatural act of an almighty God, designed in this occasion so that these men, by the way, they weren't Jews, which were an indicator, isn't it? That God desires worship from all nations. The reason why sometimes the attributed nature of them being kings was because of all the various components in the Old Testament of Zechariah and even the Psalm 72 that we read this morning, that kings would come and bow down to this king. And so many attribute to their status of a kingly nature. But they followed the star. And the star was not some GPS system, by the way. It's like, it didn't like blink red and then green so that we know that it's Christmas. It appeared, they followed it to Jerusalem, and then they followed it there, and then they were super excited because it says, when they went their way, notice this in the text, he says, as they went their way, they came out, and then they saw the star again, and it reappeared. And it was over Bethlehem. And then they would have went to Bethlehem and done the same thing they did in Jerusalem. Hey, do you know where the child is? Do you know where the child is? Do you know where the child is? And they found where the house that the child was staying, and the star served the purpose to guide them into the specific region, and all of this communication was going on, and people knew it. And they knew it, and they came. And even as let's move into this last point. The adoration of these wise men. They come with their treasures. That word for treasures is connected with this idea of coffers. It was likely this treasure box filled with these three particular gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They came to give gifts. They came to demonstrate their worship to this king. And what would it be like if you come to a king and you don't bring a gift? This was a sense of their worship and their sacrifice. They would recognize this person as something remarkable among the other king, the King Herod. It says in verse 9, after listening to king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen, it rose and went before them and came to rest where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Now, just mark this in your text. It's really hard to describe how the language is talking about their excitement. That's why he gives this phrase. They rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. What he's saying is, I don't know else how to tell you this, but they're jumping up and down. They're excited. How can we say this? They were exuberant. No one could contain them. They were so excited to see this one that they had traveled. They found him. He's in the house. They bring out this young child, this young baby. We know the exact age of Jesus at that particular moment, but we know he was within a range where when Herod would have asked, when did you see the star? He was approximating how old this child would be. And of course, in one large clean sweep, he tries to kill off all children 2 and younger to make sure that he gets this king who would usurp his reign in Judea. But they come, they go to the house, notice this, they fall down before him and they worship him. They opened up their treasures. I mean, gold we can understand. I mean, who doesn't want a little bit of that? Gold was a gift that was so prized in this particular, it always retained a level of its worth, and it was a worthy gift for the king. Frankincense that was offering this glittering and odorous kind of gummy situation where they would get it from a bark of a tree, and it was very expensive, and it was often used in the Levitical worship in the Old Testament. You can trace that back to where it was used. And the sweet-smelling aroma that frankincense would give. And then they brought myrrh, which in the same kind of way that when it was burned, it would give a sweet aroma to it. Many have postulated that the 3 gifts in and of themselves are highly symbolic, referencing the reality of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh to his deity, his sacrifice, and his humanity. Text doesn't give us a lot of symbolic cues of it. I think one thing that we can be for sure is that these men were giving gifts that were appropriate to a king as they prostrated themselves before him to worship him. And just a side note, how do you think they got to Egypt anyway? Because these were poor people on a costly journey. They were warned in a dream to not go and be under this. It is very likely, most people would say, that they're going to use this to get them where they needed to go. And God's provision for Mary and Joseph and what he knew they would endure is remarkable. These kingly gifts were given as they fell down before them. And I think it says something about the heart of worship. I want to come back to this as we close. Worship is all about sincerity. Worship is all about selflessness and sacrifice. I just ask you, is that what your worship of the King looks like in your heart during this year, in the days to come, to your family during Christmas season that is so often challenging our minds to think on everything other than Christ? Allow your family to worship this Christ, this King, in sincerity and selflessness. And even as we close this morning in conclusion, consider, what is your worship like? Is it like, maybe you're here and maybe it's more like Herod's. Yeah, I want to know him so I can just kind of make fun of him and, I don't want anything to do with him, really. Or like the scribes and the Pharisees who had all the prophecy and the very oracles of the prophets of God. And yet you're like, oh yeah, he's in Bethlehem of Judah. And yet, did you see any of them going? None of them went. They had a face value and lip service to the very things of God in their worship, but the idea of going and recognizing this one Messiah, they didn't do it. And they refused to do it the entirety of the life of Jesus. Or was it like the Wisemen, who come bringing sacrificial gifts with sincerity and selflessness, make a long journey to come and see this coming King? It's supposed to challenge us as to our worship, how sacrificial we are, how sincere we are. Matthew chapter 2 gives us an understanding in verse 13. He says, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.'" Satan does not want you to worship the King. Do you think he's changed his tactics or his mission for you and I? I think not. He would love to have all of our attention be placed somewhere else, and we miss worshiping the greatest gift that God would have ever given to us through the Son, who's brought light into the world to shed light in the darkness of sin so that we could be saved. And if you're here this morning, are in the darkness and you have never repented of your sin and trusted in Christ, this is why Christ came. This is who the wise men recognized. He has come to save us from our sin. I found it remarkable, as one commentator wrote. He said, the same title that the Magi came and gave, "Where is the King?" the one born King of the Jews. At the end of the story of Jesus' life, that same sign, this commentator says, is the same sign that hung above Jesus' body on the cross. King of the Jews. From beginning to end, he was king. He earned the right through his sacrifice to save humanity from their sin. He's come to save you. He's come to save us, and he's come to not only save us, but satisfy us in him so that our worship would be genuine. Listen to what 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into this marvelous light."